Hello, students. You might have studied the topic that we have discussed in our earlier lectures. I hope you are doing well, reading well. Of course, the topic or the terms that are prescribed for us are equally relevant to the study of the socio-political background to the modern literature. In paper number 8, we have seen the terms that are prescribed for us, and these terms are definitely landmark term. Some of the terms are called as literary movements that arised in the modern literature, and we have seen few literary terms and movements that arised in our say earlier lecture. The last term that we have studied is war poetry. War poetry is definitely a very sadistic part of our social and political history. We have seen the war has rendered its heinous and very drastic influence on the lives of the people across the world. And we have seen all these features and all these drastic consequences thereafter has challenged and moreover posed more challenges in the due course of time with regards to the human health, the culture and humanity at large. But whatever concepts and terms that we have seen along the line of our syllabus or the concepts that are there, definitely we need to go through another terms, that is movement poetry. Movement poetry is, there is no such a kind of a movement, but movement poetry is a term that has been regarded by one of the great critic on the movement poet is Robert Conquest. Robert Conquest, who called a loosely knit group of 1950s, the poets from 1950s, they are not brought under any kind of such association. It's a loose knit group, and these poets were unorganized poets. They are not a well organized poets, but they have some common features, common assumptions and poetic features to write on. All that these features brings them under the umbrella by Robert Conquest, that is movement poetry. What type of movement poetry? What are the features of this movement poetry that we need to find out? If we go through and analyze the poetry of the movement poets, we will find there are some common features. These common features are very much against the romanticism of 1930s and 1940s. It's against romanticism. And what does mean by romanticism is the use of imagination, the visions and dreams. It's a kind of a mystification, it's kind of a superstitions, and all these features that we see, the very much faith on the supernatural powers of the universe, of the nature and the God, all these are definitely regarded as an agnostic. They have gone against these features, and that is what these features were very much prevalent in 1930s and 40s. But the movement poets, and moreover the leader of the movement poet is Philip Larkin, who rebelled against the romanticism of 1930s and 40s. They have their own specific views, they have their own ideology, philosophical say, stance, basic foundation on which these movement poetry features are bounded on. And these views that these movement poets tries to propagate through their poetry. What type of features that these movement poets commonly reflected are the preferred common sense rather than obscurity and mystification. We have seen the romantic poetry is a mystic poetry. It's obscure by its own nature, by its supernaturalism, by its natural superpowers, or we can say supernaturalisms. So these superpowers, these supernaturalisms and mystifications, all these were regarded as a romantic and obscure one, but these movement poets tried to bring these poetic features to the use of common sense. So it means they wish to express their poetic thoughts, feelings, issues, and concepts in a very common way. Their poetry becomes very much common. The honesty of thought and feeling was added to the poetic expression, and there should be the clarity in the honesty of thought and feelings, their views, so that the clarity of expression is achieved in the poetry. Robert Conquest, who regarded New Lines, which was published by Philip Larkin, as an inauguration of movement poetry. It was published in 1956. So these features which we saw, we have seen that the poetry should have that sound, that music, that attitude to look at poetry as something fruitful. Poetry should be utilized to some extent to develop the realistic ideology, ideas, views, and thoughts. So, the fruitful attitude is regarded as an utmost importance for writing poetry. And that is what Philip Larkin has advocated these concepts of poetry in his so called poems. We have seen there are several poetry, several poems which are very landmark poems in the so called poetry publication by Philip Larkin, and that is what he has emerged as one of the dominant poet of the movement. His outlook towards looking at life is somewhat pessimistic, somewhat realistic, somewhat satiric. But whatever, the poet has brought the characteristic attitude. It's anti-dogmatic attitude. There should be the honesty of thought, honesty of so-called ideas and thoughts and logical ideas. It should spring out of the realistic issues and features, common man, daily livelihood. So there is this characteristic of attitude is anti-dogmatic attitude that he asserted through his poetry. The new poetry, he said, was free from both mystical and logical compulsions and was empirical in its attitude to everything. According to Robert Conquest, the new poetry, that is the poetry, it should be detached from aesthetic purity and philosophical purity. We are not looking poetry with something aesthetic, beautiful one. Beauty portrays beautiful, portrays such a wonderful thing. It's so pure, it is so artistic. So it should not be there. फिलिप लार्किन detached वेगळं करणे. This ideology, he tries to say bifurcate, separate poetry from the aesthetic poetry and philosophical poetry. So, remarkable poetry by Philip Larkin is one of such a poem is Deceptions. There is another poet, Kingsley Amis Alternatives, Donald Davies, A Christening, and Philip Larkin's wonderful poem is Wits and Weddings is very dominant moment poem. As we have seen, Philip Larkin's Wits and Weddings, wit and irony, which tops as dominant feature of the moment poetry. There is wit, intelligence, use of intelligence to express the ideas in a very thoughtful language with proper use of very innovative and musical words with proper style and technique of expression, tuned with the music, and that makes this poetry as a distinct one. And it was a movement. It's movement, the poetry, the tone of the poetry is urbane and academic at the same time. Many of the poems are too neatly prescriptive. They look at the pieces in the versified form of, say, criticism, literary criticism. See, there is the poetry by Kingsley Amis, A Bookshop Idyll. DJ Enright, The Verb to Think. Donald Davies, A Rejoinder to a Critic. The cool and ironic aloofness and intellectual detachment of some of the poems of the movement can be called as somewhat some shocking. But there is one more critic, John Press. John Press. He has quoted about the movement poetry in these, say, so-called way. Okay. He said, John Press has said, they all display a cautious, means the movement poets, all display a cautious skepticism and favor an empirical attitude, aiming at colloquial ease, decorum, shapeliness, elegance. They are trying to bring back into the currency of the language the precision, the snap, the gravity, the decisive clinching finality which have been lost since the Augustan age, neoclassical age. Movement poets are thus seen as representing a new classicism in English poetry because they tried to bring the colloquial ease, means give and take, the language used just like a give and take, sharing thoughts and views. This critic further says that the work of these poets is characterized by a general retreat from the direct comment and involvement with any political and social doctrine. A critic who says that, see, John Press, in other words, it's a kind of a new criticism. There, they have definite ideology, specific line up on the views like sex, religion, and politics. They have very definite and firm line. Larkin, who represents a deeper social understandings, contradictions, far greater range of formal and stylistic devices, more profound sense of linguistic and aesthetic possibilities that we see in the poetry. There is decline in religious faith. Symbolist and modernist trend was also reflected in Philip Larkin's poetry. See, if we go through this poem, Church Going is a very famous poem on these lines. There, the critic who has commented on the moment poets, he said that as a spokesman for the new self-proclaimed and lower middle class intelligentsia, the movement was forced into an ambivalent position, and on the other hand, opposed to the old order, indebted to and respectable towards its institutions. This critic has shown that to these ideas, Church Going, the famous poem by Philip Larkin, fits very carefully against the balancing act of agnostic dissent. देवावरचा विश्वास नसणं. So this poem, Church Going, this poem brings us both reverence and irreverence. देवासंदर्भात आदर मान सन्मान असणं आणि देवाचा मान सन्मान न ठेवणं, तिरस्कार करणं. So this balancing act is very much expressed in the poem Church Going. It is a poem which testifies to the persistence of both English church and an English poetic tradition. So these features of this poem are to be kept as movement's preferences. See, there are so many beautiful aspects of this poem. See, Church Going, this poem that begins with I'm sure there is nothing going on. I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seeds, and stone, and little books sprawling of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence. Breathed God knows how long, hatless. I take up my cycle clips in awkward reverence. So, in the very outside, these poetic lines, which span near about nine lines in the first stanza, once I'm sure there is nothing going on. चर्चमध्ये कुठेही काही होत नसेल, मला खात्री आहे. कोणी नसणार आहे तिथे. असं असलं तरी आय स्टेप इनसाइड, मी आतमध्ये गेलो. लेटिंग द डोर थर्ड शट. The door turn all its hinges with a third shut, with a boom of a door knocking on the wall. It's another church, matting, seeds, and stone, and little books and sprawling flowers. The flowers are cut for Sunday. They have turned brown. They have turned brown, pale, some brass, and there's some stuff. At the holy end, a small, neat organ. There is a neat organ. A tense, musty, unignoble silence. There is an utter silence. No one is there. What to believe? Whether the gods is to be believed or not? He don't have anything. So he was hatless. He don't have a cap, hat on his head. So he took a cycle clip in awkward reverence and puts on his head. See, another line see, move forward, run my hand around the font from where I stand. The roof looks almost new, cleaned and restored. Someone would know I don't. Mounting the lectern, I parries a few hectoring large scale verses and pronounce here end, much more loudly than I would meant. The echoes snicker briefly back at the door. I signed the book and donate an Irish sixpence. Reflect the place was not worth stopping for. See the lines. The echoes snicker briefly back at the door. I signed the book. Donate an Irish sixpence. Reflect, the place is not worth stopping for. The poet, who turns out to be such a one, he is agnostic. He won't believe on the God